Halloween night always had a way of pulling at the nerves, like a cold, invisible hand reaching up your spine, fingers pricking through the skin, reminding you that something wasn't right. The three of us, crammed in the old Chevy that had seen better days, knew that feeling well. We'd grown up on tales of haunted woods, cursed bridges, and spirits who didn't know how to rest. But that night, the air felt heavier. The darkness pressed against the windows as if it had a mind of its own, waiting for something. We were driving along the old country road, the kind that cuts through miles of nothing but trees, broken fences, and the occasional house that looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. The road twisted like a coiled snake, and the headlights barely pierced the suffocating dark. Not a single streetlight, not a single soul. It was as if the world had forgotten this place. "You ever hear that story?" the driver asked, breaking the silence that had settled between us like an unwanted guest. He didn't need to elaborate, we all knew the one. It was one of those stories that people like to whisper around bonfires, the kind that dared you to laugh it off but left a knot in your stomach just the same. "The Ghostly Hitchhiker," the guy in the back said, his voice low, like he was afraid she might hear. "The one that appears every Halloween. People say if you pass her by, she comes for you." No one spoke after that. The legend had been passed around for as long as anyone could remember. A girl, they said, had been killed out on these roads, run down by some careless driver late one Halloween night. She never got her revenge, so every year she waits for someone to ignore her. And once you do, she follows you, appears in your mirrors, in the corners of your eye, getting closer with every mile until... Well, no one knew for sure what happened after that. The road felt endless, stretching out into oblivion. The shadows outside twisted like they were alive, their shapes dancing just outside the reach of the headlights. That's when we saw her, standing on the side of the road, bathed in the pale glow of the moon, her back turned to us. Long dark hair fell over her shoulders, and her clothes hung from her body like tattered rags. She wasn't moving, wasn't signaling for help, just standing there, perfectly still, like a statue forgotten by time. "Don't stop," the driver muttered, his voice tense. He pressed down on the gas, and the car surged forward, leaving her behind in the rearview mirror. But something changed the moment we passed her. The air inside the car grew cold, colder than it had any right to be. I glanced in the mirror, half expecting to see her standing there, but the road behind us was empty. "Shouldn't have done that," the guy in the back said, his breath fogging up the window. "We should have stopped." "Yeah, well, too late for that now," the driver shot back, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "We're not playing games with some ghost story." But we weren't alone anymore. I could feel it. You know that feeling when someone's watching you? That prickling heat on the back of your neck? That's what it felt like. And it was getting worse. It started small. The radio crackled with static, despite being off. The car's engine sputtered, like it was choking on something thick and heavy. Then the guy in the back sucked in a breath, his voice shaking as he whispered, "She's here." I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. In the mirror, I saw her, sitting in the back seat, her face pale and gaunt, eyes hollow, empty. Her lips twisted into a smile that stretched too wide, too wrong. She wasn't supposed to be there. She couldn't be there. "She's right behind me," the guy in the back whimpered, his voice breaking. He was frozen, staring straight ahead, too terrified to turn around. The smell of damp earth filled the car, a thick, rotting stench that made my stomach churn. "Get her out!" the driver shouted, swerving the car as if he could shake her off. But she didn't move, just sat there, her eyes locked on us, her smile growing wider with each passing second. And then, with a screech of tires, we veered off the road. The car crashed through a patch of brush, coming to a violent stop against an old oak tree. The force knocked the wind out of me, but I was still alive. My head spun, my heart racing, but there was no time to recover. Because she was outside now, standing in front of the car, her head tilted, watching us with those same empty eyes. Slowly, she began to walk toward us. Closer, closer. The driver fumbled with his seatbelt, his hands trembling. "We have to go, we have to..." His words were cut short. In the reflection of the cracked windshield, she was already inside again, sitting in the back seat. Her smile had faded, replaced with a look of hunger. I turned to warn him, but it was too late. Her hand reached up, impossibly fast, her fingers digging into his neck. He gasped, blood spilling from his mouth, his body jerking violently as she pulled him back, deeper into the car. His eyes rolled back and then he was gone, and she turned to me, her hollow eyes fixing on mine. There was no escape. I knew that now. The curse had begun. I don't remember much after the driver's scream, except for the feeling of cold, slick blood splattering across my face. The metallic stench filled the air, sharp and suffocating. I scrambled out of the car, my legs barely functioning, mind reeling. The night swallowed me in a thick, oppressive silence, as if the world outside the car had ceased to exist. She was still in there, in the back seat. I saw her silhouette, just sitting, her head tilting back and forth like a pendulum. The driver was gone. What was left of him anyway was slumped over the steering wheel, a dark pool forming beneath his lifeless body. And she just sat there like she was waiting for me. The guy in the back wasn't moving either. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly ahead, mouth slack. He hadn't even made a sound. I don't know what she did to him, and I didn't want to know. All I knew was that I had to get away. My breath came out in ragged gasps as I bolted toward the woods, leaves and branches crunching underfoot. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat an erratic thud that echoed in my ears. I glanced over my shoulder. The car was still there, a lone island in a sea of darkness, and she was still sitting in the back seat, watching me. I didn't care. I ran. The trees were thick, their branches reaching down like skeletal fingers, clawing at my skin, tugging at my clothes. The ground beneath me was uneven, roots and rocks threatening to trip me with every step. But I couldn't stop. Not now. Not when she was out there. I don't know how long I ran before I collapsed against a tree, my legs trembling, lungs burning. The silence was so heavy, so suffocating, that for a moment I thought I was safe. That maybe, just maybe, I had outrun her. But then I heard it. A soft rustle. A whisper of movement. It was subtle at first, like the wind through the trees. But I knew better. My pulse quickened, and my hands tightened around the rough bark of the tree, fingers digging into the wood as I tried to steady myself. The sound grew closer, a low creak like footsteps crunching on brittle leaves. And then a voice. It was soft, barely above a whisper, but it crawled into my ears, sinking deep into my skull. "You passed me!" I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't want to turn around. I couldn't. But something inside me, some twisted, morbid curiosity, forced me to look. There she was, just a few feet away, standing at the edge of the woods, her pale face illuminated by the weak glow of the moon. Her eyes, those hollow, empty pits, were fixed on me. Her lips curved into that too wide smile again. "You left me behind," she whispered, her voice a raspy, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like I was rooted to the spot, held by some invisible force. I could hear my heart pounding, louder and louder, threatening to explode out of my chest. And then, she took a step toward me. "Stay away!" I screamed, my voice breaking, barely more than a strangled gasp. But she didn't stop. Her smile widened, her eyes gleaming with something that could only be described as hunger. Another step, then another. My mind was racing, searching for a way out, some escape, but there was nothing. The woods were too thick, too dark, and she was too fast. She was getting closer. I could see the dirt smeared across her face, the torn fabric of her dress fluttering in the wind. I could smell the decay on her breath, the rot clinging to her like a second skin. And then she lunged. I didn't have time to react. Her cold, bony fingers wrapped around my throat, squeezing, cutting off my air. I gasped, clawing at her hands, but it was like trying to fight off a nightmare. Her grip was too strong, her face inches from mine, those empty eyes boring into me, her breath hot and rancid against my skin. "You're mine," she hissed. I thought it was the end. I could feel my vision dimming, the world slipping away. But then, a scream. Not mine. Hers. Her grip loosened, just for a moment, and I tore myself free, stumbling backward. She stood there, her face twisted in rage, her eyes wide and wild. And then I saw it. The guy from the back seat. He was standing behind her, his face pale, his eyes glazed over. But he was there. His hands were gripping her shoulders, pulling her back. I didn't waste any time. I turned and ran. This time I didn't stop, didn't look back. I could still hear her scream, echoing through the trees, a sound that would haunt me for the rest of my life. But I was alive. For now. Because as I ran, one thought kept gnawing at the back of my mind. She wasn't done with me. Not yet. I thought I had escaped her. My body ached with every step, but adrenaline kept me moving, my mind too panicked to stop. The woods were endless, swallowing me whole, the thick canopy above blotting out the sky. It was impossible to tell how long I had been running or where I was headed, but none of it mattered. As long as I was away from that car, away from her, I still had a chance. The silence that surrounded me felt wrong, like the air itself was watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. And then, breaking through that silence, came the rustle of leaves, A soft sound at first, almost like the wind brushing through the branches, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I wasn't alone anymore. I spun around, expecting to see her, her twisted, pale face grinning back at me from the darkness. But there was nothing, just the endless black of the woods. I took a step back, fear crawling up my spine, my hands trembling at my sides. Then a voice. It was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it sliced through the quiet like a knife. "You shouldn't have left me." My breath caught in my throat, and my heart slammed against my chest. She was close. I could feel her, smell the damp earth and rot that clung to her like a second skin. But I couldn't see her. Not yet. I stumbled backward, turning on my heel and sprinting deeper into the woods. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to keep moving. But the faster I ran, the louder the footsteps behind me grew, quickening, closing the distance between us. Branches whipped across my face, and the ground beneath me seemed to shift, uneven and treacherous. I felt like the trees themselves were working against me, their roots tangling around my feet, their branches grabbing at my clothes. But I pushed through, my muscles burning, lungs screaming for air. That's when I saw it. Through the trees just ahead, an old cabin. Its windows were dark, the roof sagging from years of neglect, but it was shelter. It was my only option. I sprinted toward it, my hands outstretched as I reached for the door, shoving it open with a loud creak. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of rot and decay. Dust clung to every surface, and the floor creaked beneath my weight as I backed away from the door. I slammed it shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the pounding of my heart so loud in my ears I thought it might explode. For a moment there was silence, the kind that presses down on you, makes you feel like you're suffocating. But I was safe, at least for now. She hadn't followed me inside. Maybe she couldn't. But then I heard it, a soft knock. It wasn't on the door. It was behind me, inside the cabin. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Slowly I turned around, dread washing over me like ice water. The room was dark, but the moonlight filtering in through the cracks in the walls cast long, eerie shadows, and that's when I saw her. She was standing in the corner, her back to me, head bowed, hair hanging in tangled clumps over her shoulders. Her breathing was uneven, labored, and I could hear a faint whispering, like she was talking to herself. I took a step back, my foot catching on a loose floorboard, the creak louder than it should have been in the oppressive quiet. Her whispering stopped. For a second, everything was still. Then she began to move. Slowly she turned toward me, her body stiff and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. Her face, oh God, her face was a twisted mask of decay, skin peeling back in chunks, her mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. But that wasn't the worst part. As she took a step closer, her features began to shift, the rotting skin bubbling and tearing like something beneath was trying to push through. I stumbled backward, my eyes widening in horror as her face contorted, stretched, until it wasn't her face anymore. It was his, the driver, the one who was dead, slumped over the wheel back in the car. His wide, terrified eyes stared back at me, his mouth twisted in that same horrible, knowing smile. Blood dripped from his lips, pooling on the cabin floor as he, or she, came closer. I backed away, my mind screaming at me to run, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of it all. My breath came in shallow gasps, my legs trembling beneath me. The figure stepped closer, the sound of wet, tearing flesh filling the room as its body continued to change, shifting in grotesque ways. Now it wasn't just the driver's face, it was the guy in the back seat too. His broken, twisted neck snapped into place with a sickening crack. His eyes glazed over in death, staring through me. Then, before I could react, she, or whatever it was, lunged at me. Its cold, decaying hands wrapped around my throat, squeezing with inhuman strength. I gasped, clawing at its hands, but it was like trying to fight off a nightmare. The room began to spin, my vision blurring as darkness closed in around me. And just before everything went black, I heard the voice again, faint and distant, echoing in my ears. "You can't escape, you're next." And then everything went cold. When the darkness swallowed me, I was sure it was over. My lungs burned, my vision faded, and the icy grip on my throat tightened until I thought I'd slip into oblivion. But then something unexpected happened. The hands around my neck loosened. The pressure eased. I gasped, sucking in a sharp breath of air, my head spinning. My body, trembling and weak, collapsed to the floor, but I was alive, and so was the cabin. The oppressive cold that had filled the room moments before was gone, replaced by a strange warmth that seeped into my skin. I blinked, trying to focus, trying to understand why I wasn't dead, why she wasn't dragging me into whatever nightmare she'd come from. I looked up. The figure stood over me, but she wasn't the twisted, rotting thing I'd seen before. Her decayed skin had softened, healed. Her eyes, no longer hollow pits of darkness, were wide and sad, filled with a sorrow that made my heart ache. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her lips quivered as she looked down at me, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized something. She wasn't here to kill me. She was here for something else. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she whispered, her voice trembling like a gust of wind on the verge of tears. "I just wanted someone to listen, to help me." The terror that had gripped me for so long started to ebb away. Slowly I sat up, my body still shaking, but now from confusion rather than fear. "Help you? How can I help you?" Her figure flickered in and out of focus, like an old film reel losing its grip on reality. "I've been lost for so long," she said softly. "Every Halloween I wander, looking for the one who left me behind. But it wasn't my fault. It was never my fault." The memories of the legend, the stories we'd all heard around campfires flashed in my mind. The ghostly hitchhiker, the girl who was killed on these roads. Everyone had assumed she was seeking revenge for her death, angry at the world. But what if we'd all been wrong? "What happened to you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Her face softened, the tension easing from her once grotesque features. "I was left here, abandoned. All I wanted was for someone to come back, to take me home." She looked down at her hands, once twisted and monstrous, now soft and human, but no one ever did. I swallowed hard, the pieces falling into place. She wasn't a killer. She wasn't a vengeful spirit. She was lost, stuck in some cruel loop, doomed to relive the night she was abandoned over and over again, hoping someone would notice her, but no one ever did. Until tonight. "Is there a way to stop this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "To help you move on?" Her eyes, still filled with sadness, flickered with the faintest glimmer of hope. "Maybe," she said, "if someone remembers me, if someone forgives me." I stood slowly, my legs trembling but holding me up. "I forgive you," I said, the words leaving my mouth before I even realized I'd said them. And I meant it. Whatever had happened to her, whatever anger had kept her bound to this place, it wasn't her fault. For the first time, her expression softened completely. The air around us shifted, growing warmer, brighter. The shadows that had lurked in the corners of the room melted away, replaced by a soft golden glow. It was like the cabin itself had come alive, no longer a place of horror, but a sanctuary. Her form grew lighter, less solid, like mist on the verge of fading away. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible now. "I've been waiting so long." I watched as she began to dissolve, her features softening, her figure becoming transparent. And then, with a final, peaceful smile, she disappeared completely, leaving nothing but the warmth in the room behind. I stood there for a long moment, my heart still racing, trying to process what had just happened. I had expected the night to end in blood and terror, but instead, there was peace. The weight that had pressed down on my chest since we'd passed her on the road was gone. The curse, or whatever had kept her trapped in this nightmare, was broken. When I finally stepped outside the cabin, the night had transformed. The oppressive darkness had lifted, revealing a sky full of stars, their light shining down like beacons of hope. The air was cool but no longer biting, and for the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe. I made my way back through the woods, my steps slow, cautious. The car was still where we'd left it, the driver's seat empty, the engine cold. I don't know what happened to my friends, whether they'd met the same fate or somehow escaped, but I knew one thing for sure. The ghostly hitchhiker was gone, and with her, the curse that had haunted these roads for so many years. As I stood there looking down the dark, empty road, I couldn't help but smile. Somehow, against all odds, I had survived the night, and more importantly, so had she.